Hi, welcome to day 2 of our Sew Lunchables. We're still ironing things out. I'm your sewing Sherpa Shauna, and today do a quick tutorial on how to do buttonholes by the sewing machine, and if we have time, I'll show you one done by hand as well. So when I do buttons and buttonholes, I do the buttonholes first. And last week we did one about how to put buttons on by machine. But in the studio, when I'm sewing a shirt or something, I'll do my buttonholes first and then do the buttonholes second, because I use the buttonholes to line up where the buttons are going to go, because sometimes the buttonholes get off by a little bit. So I have a computerized sewing machine and a mechanical machine. I'm going to start with the mechanical machine. I put blue thread on the top and red on the bottom to make it a little bit easier to see the difference and to see the tension situation. And here I have just 2 layers of fabric. Now, oftentimes when you're doing buttonholes, they recommend that you put in some interfacing to keep it super stable. This is a really crisp fabric that stays quite stable on its own. But if you don't have that, you do want to put interfacing between the 2. I don't know, I had a pen explosion earlier and I don't even know where the pen's at. But if you don't want to use interfacing, because I find interfacing scares me, because sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, depends on the glue and the brand and the fabric I'm using. You can use a real stiff organza. I like silk organza and use that as your stabilizer. So first of all, when you're doing a buttonhole, you need to have a button. And I have got a lot of buttons in here. I'm going to pull out just a random, let's see, something I can see. There's a nice black button. And to mark a button hole, of course, you would want to have it on your placket or whatever, but your buttonhole needs to be as wide as your button is, I mean, as tall as your button is, and then also as wide. So I've got a little bit extra that I need to add to it. So that is the actual, oops, it's not quite lined up. That's okay. This is a sample, and I do recommend that you sew multiple samples before you go into making your actual buttonhole, because things are funny on the machine. So I'm going to line this up here, and it looks like my buttonhole is going to be approximately 1 inch. Looks like it's a little bit under 1 inch. I prefer a little bit of a smaller buttonhole to a larger buttonhole, just because the buttonholes tend to worry themselves bigger. So you can draw a line. This actually is going to get cut. I usually don't draw a line, but you can draw a line. That indicates the beginning and the end. I'll usually just do a dot and a dot, but if you're concerned about sewing straight, sometimes that line will help you. So I have on a regular presser foot, and I don't want to use the regular presser foot. You can sew a buttonhole with a regular presser foot, but if you're going to, if you don't have a buttonhole foot, which looks like this, and this is the buttonhole foot with the shank attached, this is a snap-on style, I would recommend using an embroidery foot over just the regular foot, because an embroidery foot has got the bottom kind of dug out so you can let the buttonhole go through. But it's best to have a buttonhole foot. So I pop this on, and then this, when I sew a buttonhole on this machine, it starts at the back and it goes forward. I do the end, and then it goes back to the beginning. So I know I want a 1 inch buttonhole. So I'm going to measure the end here, and it turns out that this line right here is my 1 inch line. So I don't actually have to have it drawn on my fabric. I just have to know where that 1 inch line is at. Whoa, push the wrong thing, I dropped it. This is how you don't do it. All right, so I'm gonna slide this up to 1 inch. This is lined up to that, and that's lined up to my hole. And it's all just this delicate balance in between these 3 things. Drop it. Now, the next thing I need to do, let's see, that line's gonna help me square it up. The next thing I need to do is access my buttonhole series. So on this one, I have this yellow series. Here's my buttonhole series, and you have to have glasses on to see this, but that one says 1, and it's got an arrow going forward, and I can see it's dark on the left-hand side. So I assume I'm gonna be sewing the zigzag on the left-hand side, and it's gonna be going forward. The next thing I need to do is go over here and turn this down. So I've got like this area that says BH. So they're saying that's my buttonhole area. Then a buttonhole has got to have some width to that zigzag. It can't be a straight stitch. So I'm just, they don't, you know, maybe in your book it'll tell you, but this goes from 0 to 5. So I'm going to put it somewhere in the middle and I'll adjust as I go. This is why you want to do some samples first. So I'm going to turn my needle so that it's in, and I'm going to start sewing. All right. Now if you'll notice, well, I'm just going to go all the way to the end here. And boom, it stopped. Now I'm going to go into number 2. And it's doing a wider zigzag. And I'm going to go to 3, which is going backwards. And this one's not going backwards very well, so I'm actually having to pull it a little bit. It's actually going forward, and that's so weird. It's almost like the backwards not working. Maybe I need to hold on to this reverse or something. Kind of a pain. But then I go to number 4, which is also the same as number 2, and that's the bar tack at the top. Now, if I pull this out, you're going to see something real funny. And what is it? My top thread's blue, but all you see here is red, right? So when I'm doing a buttonhole, I need to adjust the tension. I need to reduce the top tension because obviously the top is pulling the bottom up with this zigzag. It could be a problem with this machine, or it could be, I don't know, probably this machine needs to have a little bit of work done on it. So now I'm going to find another spot. I know that this is my 1-inch mark. I'm going to use that 1-inch mark again, drop it down. I've reduced my tension. I want a little bit wider. I thought that was a little bit too narrow, so I'm going to bring it up to 3.5. Oh, and then I got to get back to stitch 1. So I'm going forward. And now this time I've got blue in the top. So it hit the end. Always have your needle in the up position when you switch to a new stitch, because see how that needle moves, and if it's inside the fabric, it can bend your needle. And now I've done the end bar tack, and I'm going to go to stitch 3, which is going backwards. And again, I don't know, this is not really getting it backwards the way I want it to. So I'm pulling a little bit as I go. Back to the top, stitch 4, and that is sewn in place. That is a mechanical buttonhole, and it's basically just zigzag stitches. So if you have a zigzag stitch on your sewing machine and you have an embroidery foot, you could do it. You don't actually need to have this foot to make that happen. So one of the favorite ways for opening up this buttonhole is taking a pin, pinning off the end just before the bar tack. And then you stick your seam ripper in between the two and slide. See, this kind of thing terrifies me because I'm like, you put the buttonholes in like very last thing. When you're doing a shirt, it's like the very, very last thing. So if you mess up your buttonhole, you mess up your whole shirt. I'll oftentimes do like faux buttonholes or whatever and just kind of sew the button in place because I don't like opening, I don't like cutting into it. That's a final thing. So you oftentimes have these little threads and you can cut those off. The pin just keeps you from accidentally sliding too fast and going through your bar tack at the end. I mean, that's repairable, but it's not great. Another way you can do it is fold the fabric in half and snip in. And then cut to the end and cut to the end. That's normally how I do it. So that's our mechanical buttonhole. And now I'm going to go over to the computerized one. Computerized one has got a slightly different foot. Now, not all computerized machines have this foot, but this one does. It's pretty great. It has a slider here. And I'll put the button that I'm after sewing. So like if all my buttons are that size, I'll put that back there and I will skinny it up so that it's in there. Now I'm going to lift my presser foot, drop the all-purpose foot, pop this one on, and you'd think I'm ready to sew, but I'm not. I got to pick my buttonhole. So this is one of the things I like about computerized machines is they oftentimes have a lot of different buttonholes to choose from. And each one of these buttonholes does have a purpose. Like it handles knit fabrics better or heavy fabrics better, or, you know, there's just a lot of different reasons why, but the standard one is number 30. So I'm just going to go with the number 30 right now. 1, 2, 3. And I'll put my fabric under. And I'll drop it, and I'm going to start sewing, and I'm going to get error 3. Error 3 on this machine means that I have forgotten one step. This machine has got this thing you pull down to engage the automatic portion of the buttonhole. So I've dropped that down, and I'm in stitch 30, and so that means that I should be ready to go. So when I'm sewing on the mechanical machine, I usually don't stop between buttons. I will just move from one to the other, and I usually give myself a starting point. So, you know, of course, I'll measure these, and they'll be actually perfectly spaced and all that stuff. But I'm going to go in here, and if you look in the middle, right there, there's like this target right in the middle. I want it to be right there. That's where I'm starting. It's right in the middle of the eye. Everything's lined up. And if you'll notice, there's no room in front here. So how am I going to start sewing? Well, I don't know. I'm just going to leave. And I've got this little tail here. I'm going to try and get that out of the way. I mean, it'll get caught into the sewing, but I find that to be annoying. All right. Because with these types, it goes backwards. And now it hits that and it stops it. Front. Now it's finishing up on the side. Other side. I mean, this is super reinforced. Forget about ever unpicking this buttonhole, and I'm not even joking. I have tried to unpick these buttonholes with the computerized sewing machine, and it's a no-fly zone. It's like once that buttonhole's sewn, you might as well just cut it open because that's how bad it is. And it automatically adjusted the tension down, so you can see there's none of the bottom thread is on the top. I've only got the gray thread on the top. Now I'm going to lift my needle up, lift my foot up, slide back, find my next hole, drop it down, square it up in the middle, and begin sewing. And it'll repeat that, and it'll repeat that, and it'll repeat that. So that's, if you as you notice, that is way easier than fiddling around with the mechanical, like and you have to remember so many things. Honestly, I think these are kind of fun to sew because you do have to remember so many things. But the automatic buttonholers do a really great job. Now let's check and see if the buttonhole size, because I'll tell you what, one of the things that gets me about these, where you put the button on the back and then make the buttonhole. I find that oftentimes I don't like the size, like I have to adjust it a little bit. So when I stick this button through, actually this one's pretty good, but oftentimes it's actually a little bit sloppy. So what I'll do is, of course, I always do a sample buttonhole in the actual fabric that I'm going to be using, so that I know exactly how it's going to turn out. But oftentimes what I'll do is, after I set this button here, I will sneak that button out, and then I'll snap this just one click closer, one or sometimes 2 clicks closer, and that'll make that buttonhole just a little bit smaller. Because as you know, when you're using your buttons, like they tend to worry the buttonhole's bigger and bigger and bigger, and then all of a sudden you're having to sewing your buttonholes to make them smaller and stuff like that. So how much time do we have left?
We're at 20 minutes, but we started a little bit early with the recording, so.
Oh, okay, so we're very, okay, so one of the things that I wanted to kind of point out is that when you're working with a really big button, obviously, that ain't gonna work, right? You can't get that in there. So a big button is not gonna work with the automatic button holder. Now, a big button is also not gonna work with these types of feet, whoa, because it only goes to a certain like size of buttonhole. And honestly, it's smart not to do this kind of a buttonhole for a very large button, because the bigger that hole gets, the more it's just gonna flop open. It's gonna always be open. When you get into this size of button, you really need to have an alternative buttonhole planned, like a welt buttonhole or something that's very stabilized all the way around it. You could also do a very stabilized buttonhole and then hand stitch it with what I call a blanket stitch. And what I think I'm going to do, though, because we're about there at 15 minutes, is I'm going to do another week on buttonholes, because there's a lot of fun things you can do with buttonholes. Like there's this little tip up here at the front on most of these buttonhole feet that you can use to cord a buttonhole with. So I think we're going to do a little session on how to use cording in a buttonhole and why you would use cording in a buttonhole. We'll talk a little bit about doing that blanket stitch in case you get into the large size buttons, because big buttons are fun. So any questions? Bravo, Shauna. Yay, thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very informative.